Okay, everybody, let's get started. We've got a lot of stuff to transact. First, I want to welcome everybody who's here, who's visiting with us. We're thrilled to have you visiting with us at All Saints Church today. Some books written by our speaker today are on sale. Simply want to hold up a few. Mindsight for me is, I keep this as close to me as I keep my Bible, and I reread it all the time, and there are a lot of stories from sermons that you've heard taken from Mindsight, which is a real kind of threshold foundational work. Brainstorm, it is an amazing book about the adolescent brain, taking care of a lot of bad myths that we have about adolescents being small adult brains. Really important read. We have one on the childhood brain, and then the latest book, No Drama Discipline, was out by Dan, and you can pick all of these up. And he will stay after this time to autograph books. Now, I'm tempted to tell you a whole bunch of stuff about Dan, but I think you're much more interested in hearing from Dan. I just want to tell you that Dan Siegel has brought newness and light to my thinking in the last 2 years, ever since I went through a class of his in Santa Monica all of last year, and we've become corresponding and conversational friends. He's a man of the heart as well as the brain, and you're going to hear all sorts of things about the essence of what he's working on and what he's thinking about now. He's one of the freshest thinkers on the planet. So, will you please warmly welcome Dr. Dan Siegel. Do your thing.
All right. Thank you. Any questions? How are you supposed to speak after those statements? It's a real honor to be here with you, all of you, and Ed, thank you for inviting me to be here with your community. And I really like to make eye contact, but that means I'm going to be turning like this all day long. So what I'll do is just scan every now and then, but no, I'm taking you in through the back of my head. So in this time that we have together, which is going to go till what? So I know, till 11. What I'd like to do is walk you through a journey that I think we're on as a human family that has incredible potential for transformation of our world, from an inner journey that we can each take as individuals, to families of parents raising children, to teachers and how they connect with kids in schools, to how corporations work and have people functioning in those organizations, how governments even approach policy, and hopefully, and I just came back from the Holy Land, how we can have different nationalities and different ethnic backgrounds and different religious backgrounds and different cultural histories that have gone by for thousands of years actually find common ground and find a way to transform hate into love. And so that's the promise of what we're going to talk about. And I've always reflect on the words of Mahatma Gandhi, who said, we need to be the change we wish to see in the world. So the empowering place to start is that, as we all know, we're being bombarded these days with more information about an extended world that is itself more complicated than it's ever been. And that information we're getting is more, and some people say in 2 months we may receive as much information as people used to receive in a lifetime. So what do we do? Because we have the same brains we've had all these years, but we're being bombarded with all this information. And it is true, and I feel sad to say this, but when you speak to historians, it is true, the world is actually changing faster than it's ever changed. It's not just an impression, it's actually happening. And I'll give you an example. Do any of you have cell phones? If you would show the cell phone to someone, let's say about 150 years ago, they would burn you at the stake because they would say you have some kind of devil inside you, that you could think you could do that. And my wife and I were in South Africa recently. I was teaching down there, and our son was traveling around the world, and he was, I believe, in Taiwan at the time. And anyway, he FaceTimed us. And there we were walking through in Africa, and he was in Asia, and we were looking at each other's faces. Can you imagine 150 years ago if someone told you that might be possible? You'd think they were out of their minds, right? And speaking of the mind, that's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about an entity called the mind, and this word that was mentioned in the title of the book, Mindsight. And that's going to be the title of this presentation, which is, what is the fundamental basis of the idea that we could change from each individual to each family, to each school, to each community, to larger cultures, could change the way we actually live. And the word mindsight is a place to start. So I'm going to define it. We're going to see how we can feel it. We're going to see how you could maybe cultivate it if it's something you choose to do. And we're going to try to take a look at some of the interesting implications that this one simple word has for the melting away of the boundaries that have been so historically set up between science and spirituality, between religion and research. Those worlds have so often been separated, and there's often tension between the notion that you can lead a spiritual life and you can also be grounded in science. So that's what we're going to try to do in this next half hour. So to start with, Mindsight, that word is a word that for me is something that came to me here in Southern California when I was in medical school in Boston. I dropped out because the way medical school was going was so, for me, confusing, because my professors were having us see human bodies with disease as if they lacked a central subjective reality of that person's feelings, thoughts, hopes, dreams, longings, beliefs, narratives, meanings. All of those things we're going to put under the word mind. So I'm not separating mind from, let's say, heart by any means. For me, the word mind is usefully applied to any inner subjective reality you may experience, including your emotions. So we're not separating cognition here from mind and emotions from mind. No, we're putting it all under one thing. And the reason to do that is because the inner subjective life you have of thoughts, which are called cognitions, or emotions, which is what people usually think of as the heart, when they're separated, it actually is destructive for us. But we do that in common language. People will even say, oh, you're talking about the mind, where's your heart, and all that. And so it's a really important thing not to separate those two. Now, when we do that, we say, well, how can medical professors not see the inner life of a person? And that's because we have two ways of perceiving the world. One is something we'll call physical sight. So these really smart professors could see that a body had a physical set of dimensions to it. You could do lab tests, you could do x-rays, you could do all sorts of ways of doing a physical exam, and you could determine, for example, that this body had a disease and that this body was going to die. And then you, as a person in a body who was a professor of medicine, could say to the person whose lab test showed they were going to die, using language, you could say, I'm sorry to tell you, but you are going to die. And they would walk away. And I would yank at their coats and say, don't you want to talk to the patient about how she feels? And literally they would say, why? Why would I do that? And I didn't actually know how to respond. As this young student, and they would just move on to the next patient who would get their physical assessment and physical treatment. So I dropped out of school because of these repeated experiences, and I went on this kind of journey to try to figure out what to do with my life, and I tried out all sorts of different things. But what happened to me in that time away from a socialization process, whether it was high school or college or my family or medical school, was to be alone with my inner life and realize that the inner life we have of the mind, while it can't be measured, and maybe it can't be ever seen directly by anyone else, it is real. So we'll call it subjective, meaning the subject who's experiencing it is the one who knows it, but that doesn't make it not real, even if you can't measure it. So Einstein had said a long time ago that not everything that's measurable is important, and not everything important is measurable. So just because you can't quantify subjective experience doesn't mean it's not real. But since I'm trained as a scientist, I'll tell you this: science progresses by careful observation that can be done in a verifiable way by other observers, and it's often, though not always, quantifiable. So when I was trained in biochemistry, we had to carefully quantify how many molecules we had in a test tube. But an anthropologist doesn't quantify narratives they get across cultures, but they're carefully observing, and they gather data that other people can observe. So it's always observable data. So in psychology, about 100 years ago, a decision was made: if psychology is going to be a real part of science, it's got to give up subjective experience as its main focus and find a way to observe the output of the psyche, which is the mind, psychology, the study of the psyche. So I'm saying all this because you have really smart people then who start living a world of physical sight. So when I was in my year of being away and ultimately decided to go back to the same medical school, I made up the word Mindsight, saying, okay, you can have physical sight, which a lot of people have, but it's distinct from Mindsight. And what is Mindsight? Mindsight is how you pick up the inner life of yourself or the inner life of someone else. And it also includes respecting the differences that you find. So how can we summarize that in accessible English terms? Insight would be knowing your own inner life. Empathy would be knowing the inner life of someone else. And a term that we're going to get into in a moment called integration would be how you honor differences and promote compassionate linkages. So this was the framework that allowed me to go back to school and allowed me to use the people who were only having physical sight as examples of people not to be like. So it was actually kind of useful to have the name Mindsight in my head. And then when I came back here to Southern California to continue my training, I found in pediatrics that families that had Mindsight, even with a devastating illness of a child, as a family they did better. They could deal with stress better if they could see the mind, which now is completely consistent with the new studies of stress that you may be familiar with, which is that how your mind approaches stress completely determines the outcome of stress on your health. So people who basically say, God, my heart is pounding, I'm sweating, this is really horrible, I'm overtaxed, I'm out of time, I don't know what to do, this is really terrible, it's going to have a terrible outcome for them. But people with the same kind of situation, with even the same physiological reaction, who reframe it and say, oh, my body's adapting to a challenging situation by getting myself ready for the difficulty ahead, and this is just a part of being life when something really matters. And when it matters, of course, my body's going to respond. And instead of this being threatening, I see this as challenging. Instead of this being a terrifying anxiety, I see this as excitement. And they've done carefully controlled studies that when you are aware of your mind and reframe with your mind how this experience is affecting your body, even if the physiological measures, many of them, remain the same, the outcome of that, quote, stress is going to be completely different. In fact, there are some studies suggest that when you reframe stress, it is the basis, actually, of a meaningful life. That people who have no stress in their life have meaningless lives. And that's pretty stressful. So you see, you want to get meaning in your life. So Mindsight helps us understand, in fact, how to take the day-to-day stressors and turn them into growth rather than destruction. That's the power of Mindsight, that we can do that. We even know that the way you see your mind is a gateway to seeing someone else's mind. So, for example, if you learn techniques which are teachable to develop Mindsight skills. So in the Mindsight book, you have them, and you see other people getting them. In the Brainstorm book, I wanted to teach these skills to the reader, and the book is written for adolescents to read. And I got a little note from an adolescent, a 14-year-old who got the book, and he wrote me a note, and he said, "I've just got to tell you how different I am now that I've read the book and I'm doing these exercises, because now I feel empowered in who I am, and I feel important as a teenager instead of how I used to feel was that there was something wrong with me and I didn't matter." And that's just with reading a book based on these Mindsight ideas. So what does this mean? What this means is that if we grow up in a world, which we tend to do after we're 5 years of age, where most of what happens in school for a kindergarten kid, a first grader, a second grader, on up, is it the development of physical sight or the development of Mindsight? You tell me. Physical sight. Everything is about the physical world. Even yesterday, for Caltech, they have an annual meeting where they have early childhood focus on science, technology, engineering, and math for preschool kids. And I'm serious. It's actually a wonderful thing. It's because, as you know, we as Americans, we need to do something to get our kids more focused on STEM, is what it's called: science, technology, engineering, math. Now, the people who love the arts, of course, put in an A there and say, let's not do STEM, let's make it STEM to STEAM. And those of us who like relationships make it not just STEAM, we make it STREAM. Very good, you're fast. So we're going to flow with all these STREAM things. But what the Caltech people said to me was, we do the social emotional stuff anyway. We're just saying, let's make sure we also do STEM. So it was a beautiful event. And what was really cool was that they'd asked me to come to try to put a frame on this for the educational people. And the whole talk I gave yesterday was about Mindsight and how we have to continue teaching Mindsight beyond preschool. Yet we don't do it. So the world gets physical sight, so you get some professors of medicine who have been so valued for their physical sight abilities, then they get MDs, they become teachers, and they get some young person like myself, and they try to twist them into doing what a lot of I saw my colleagues do, which was in the locker room when we put on our white coats. They started talking about the patients they were seeing as if they were kidneys or livers, or, God, I saw a great heart today. And I go, well, didn't you see a person? They go, oh, come on, Dan, like this. That was by the second year. They were already being conditioned to be physical sight dominant, and their Mindsight abilities were kind of vanishing. So insight, how do you develop insight? Well, it's actually quite simple. You actually can learn about how the mind can be seen. Now, we have a bit of a problem because we have a word called Mindsight, which is insight, empathy, and integration. But we can take the word part of it, sight, and say that's kind of how you perceive something. Like eyesight lets you see the physical world. Mindsight lets you see the mental world. But we need to define the mind. And without defining it, then what does the word really mean? So I'm going to now give you some take-home points that are kind of mind-blowing in a way. But I've asked 100,000 mental health professionals around this planet if they've ever been given a definition of the mind. And what percentage do you say? These are mental health professionals, right? So psychiatrists, psychologists, social workers, educational therapists, dance therapists, movement therapists, anyone dealing with mental well-being. What percentage around this planet of asking groups of 100,000 that I've asked in face-to-face, like in rooms like these, like this one, what percentage said, yes, I got a lecture that said what the mental was of my profession? 0, wow, okay. Well, close. It's about 2 to 3% say yes. Let's make it 3%. 3%. So 97% of mental health professionals in all different disciplines all around the planet, new and young, older and experienced, no definition of the mind. So how can we expect them to define what a healthy mind is, right? I've asked now 19,000 just preschool through 12th grade teachers, and it's the exact same percentage. But yet what they're doing is trying to help the mind develop. So this is a really peculiar thing. I've asked chair people of departments of psychology, psychiatry, neuroscience, anthropology, sociology, and philosophy of mind, and you may be startled to find none of those fields has a definition of mind short of the following phrase: the mind is brain activity. Now, brain activity is ions flowing in and out of membranes and chemicals being released. So if that person is really equating love, hope, meaning with ions flowing in and out, even if it's dependent on ions flowing in and out, it's not the same thing. So what are we going to do with that? So through a long line of reasoning, here's a definition of mind that I'm going to offer you. Number 1, it includes subjective reality. There's no other place to put subjective reality other than under the category of mind. Now, I was once in a debate with someone who said psychiatrists should never learn psychotherapy because psychotherapy deals with feelings. Feelings are not real and haven't been proven by science, so we shouldn't do something unscientific like talk about feelings. So, of course, what did I say to him as the opponent? I said, I feel sad. And I don't know of any science that says that you exist. So it's a common view to let subjectivity disappear. And because we have physical sight, you can actually not perceive your subjective world, which is really a bizarre situation. So the first thing to say, okay, it includes subjective reality. But what I'm going to suggest to you is that there's even something more. There's something more that is a pathway to linking science and spirituality. And that something more has to do with a process called emergence. And when you actually study mathematics, you find that when a system, let's say like a cloud, which is comprised of basic elements, in that case water molecules, and has the 3 qualities of being open to influences from outside itself, so it's open. It's capable of being chaotic, so randomly distributed, chaos capable, and it is what's called nonlinear, meaning you do a small thing to this thing and large and unpredictable results ensue. So those 3 qualities, open, chaos capable, nonlinear, that gets you into a category of system called a complex system. And the mathematics of complex system tells us that we have emergent properties that just naturally arise from a complex system. You don't need a conductor, you don't need a programmer, it just arises. That's pure science of math. So what I'm going to suggest to you is that the mind is an emergent property of a complex system of you. How many of you feel like you're open to influences from outside of what you would think you are? And how many think that you're capable of being chaotic sometimes? And how many of you feel like small things that might happen to you lead to large and unpredictable results? So you are a nonlinear, chaos-capable, open system, so you're a complex system. And that doesn't mean you're complicated, because complexity is actually quite simple. So don't get fretting like, oh my God, I'm going to be more complicated. I want a life of simplicity. Actually, complexity is very simple. And when you look at complex systems, you say, okay, well, if the mind has something to do with a complex system, what emergent property is it? You look deeply into the math and you find that the mathematics of complex systems says that one of those emergent properties is something called self-organization. Self-organization is just a term out of math that says that as an emergent property, you're going to arise from the interaction of the elements of the system, like water molecules bumping into each other in a cloud. But they don't line up in a straight line, that would be rigidity, and they don't become completely random, that would be chaos. They're capable of that, but they generally don't do it because self-organization does something very specific to not only arise from the elements, but it turns back and regulates it. So here's the amazing thing. You can ask questions about the mathematics of self-organization. And if I were to ask you, what is the basic element of your system of mind? Think about it. Would it be water molecules like a cloud? What is you? Who are you?
Spirit.
It could be spirit. What is spirit?
Your spirit goes with the body. You're a living spirit.
Great. So what is the essence of living spirit?
It's a mystery. Some things are, see, science tries to reduce everything to explanations. Some things are miracles, and there's passion there.
Okay, right. So we could say there's passion and miracles and then say science, stay away. We could do that. And that's what's been done for thousands of years.
It says there are miracles too. And they're
Yes. So let's assume for a moment that even spirit could be understood more deeply if we asked fundamental questions about it. And there's nothing about asking questions that takes away the majesty and mystery of the miracle of being alive and having spirit. Let's just assume that for a moment. And one of my dear friends, John O'Donohue, a Catholic priest who's no longer with us, we were writing a book together, and this was part of the wrestling, was exactly the question you're asking. Can you go deeply with questions and not destroy the mystery? And the fantastic thing is, the questioning is the journey, not the coming up with answers, because there may be no final answer. And so that's okay. So let's ask the question. So you could say energy. Now, if we said energy, where would energy find its root in, let's say, your body? If the mind is both in the head, in your brain, and also having something to do with your body, where does energy play out in the body? Well, energy is exactly what the nervous system is all about. It is the movement of energy as it changes. I'm reluctant to say time because physicists are telling us time doesn't exist, but in moment to moment there is changing in the ever-present now. There are changes in energy. And sometimes energy doesn't have information, but other times patterns of energy, like if I say Golden Gate Bridge, it has information. So we can say the phrase energy and information being a pattern of energy with symbolic value. So even subjective experience is based on energy and information. And we also have this fundamental thing that we live in a body, which is energy and information flow. And we have this other entity called relationships. So you come here as a community, and someone gets up here, sometimes it's Ed, sometimes it's other people like myself, and what's happening right now between me and you, or when Ed is up here, between Ed and yourselves? What is happening that's connecting you? It's an exchange of energy and information. So relationships are the sharing of energy and information. And the body, bless you. Let's have a bless you for everyone who's going to sneeze. Ready? You are blessed. So energy and information is shared in relationships, and the embodied mechanism is what we call the brain. So what would the mind be? Well, what I'm going to suggest to you is the mind, besides subjective experience, maybe related to, maybe not, but beyond subjective experience, the mind can be defined as the self-organizing, emergent, embodied, and relational process. So it happens within us and between us, the embodied relational process that regulates the flow of energy and information. And when you look at that definition, then you can ask the next question is, how do you promote optimal self-organization? And it turns out that mathematics tells us. When self-organization is not going well, you enter either rigidity or chaos. And when it's going well, you're in a state of harmony. So if you want to picture it like a river, you've got a river of integration, which is harmony. It's flexible and adaptive. It's energized and vital. When you're outside of that flow of integration, you'll see, you're in chaos, or you're in the other bank of the river, rigidity. And the interesting thing is integration is what creates optimal self-organization. Integration is defined as the linkage of differentiated parts. Now, when you link differentiated parts, you can do that in your body. You can do that in your relationships. So every parenting book that you'll ever see me write, with Tina Payne Bryson or with Mary Hartzell or by myself, it's based on the fundamental view that comes from this Mindsight stance that integration is health. That the goal of parenting is to create integration in a relationship within the family that amazingly, and I revised the first textbook with 15 interns, I asked them to disprove this, but all we could do is support it. Integration relationally stimulates the growth of integration in the nervous system. And every form of regulation, regulating attention, regulating memory, regulating emotion, regulating your behavior, regulating your relationships, those are all called self-regulation or executive functions. In the brain, every form of regulation depends on integration in the brain. So this simple statement, integration in relationships stimulates the growth in the brain. I'm talking about relationships changing the structure of the brain. They stimulate the growth of integrative fibers. Now, I was teaching one time in Alaska, and I was telling a sad case that is the first chapter of the Mindsight book of a woman who sadly didn't put her seatbelt on when she was going to get milk for her kids. And a drunk adolescent driver smashed into her, and her head went right into the forehead. Her head went right into the windshield, and she smashed her forehead in a terrible way on the steering wheel. And it's a long story neurologically, but the bottom line is she destroyed a part of her brain behind her forehead. She was in a coma for a long time. She went into neurosurgery. She had plastic surgery. And 9 months after rehab, she came back home and her daughter stopped speaking. And so you'll see in that book the case of what happened there. And just because of time, I'll just give you the take-home issue, was in trying to help the family make sense of how this loving, devoted mother had been changed by damage to a specific area of her brain, where she lost the following 9 functions. She lost the ability to regulate her body. She lost the ability to tune into herself or others. She lost the ability to balance her emotions. She was challenged when it came to pausing before she responded. She couldn't soothe her fears. She had difficulty connecting her past with her present and creating a future for herself called insight. She couldn't imagine what was going on inside of another person to create a map of their minds, Mindsight map of another called empathy. She no longer acted at a number of times morally, thinking about being a part of larger social good. And she also was impaired in intuition. The wisdom of the body was no longer available to her. 9 functions. So I'm teaching this in Alaska, and at the break, a woman comes up to me who it turns out was the head of the Inuit tribes in the northern Alaskan islands. And she says, Dan, do you know what that list was? I said, oh yeah, that was the list of the prefrontal cortex. Well, she goes, I know, I heard what you said, but do you know what that list was all about? I go, what do you mean? She goes, for my people, in the oral tradition, for 5,000 years, that is the list of what we've been handed down as the way to live a wise and kind life. And then after that, I was teaching in the Midwest, and there were people from the Lakota tradition who said the exact same thing. And then I was teaching in the South Pacific. People in the Polynesian tradition said the same thing. People in the Christian tradition, the Jewish tradition, the Islamic tradition, the Hindu tradition, the Buddhist tradition, all sharing the same fundamental prefrontal integrative functions that are based on integration. How could that be the case? And amazingly, this same list is what comes out of healthy, strong, secure attachments. At least the first 8 of the 9. And when you look at something called mindfulness studies, teaching people to be in the present moment through meditative techniques, these, all 9 of them are the outcome of mindfulness research. And if you talk to therapists and say, what do you think about these 9? They go, oh my God, I'd love that to be the outcome of psychotherapy. They say that that would be true. So why would mental health wishes from therapists, secure attachment, integrated functioning in the brain, religious wisdom traditions, and spirituality and mindfulness practice, why would they all go together like that? I think it's a complete coincidence. So it could be that the mind, once we define it as an embodied and relational process, and that totally pisses off scientists because no one talks about the mind this way. They'll say the brain is social and it's responding to social signals, but they'll never say the mind is relational like this. So number one, we're saying it's not just in the head, we're saying it's fully embodied. Then we're going further and saying it's not just in the body, it's also between us as well as within us. And then we're going a step further and saying it's an emergent, self-organizing process. And once we say that, we say, hey, the purpose of the mind is to integrate. And then we see that the boundary between spirituality and science can dissolve. Because if all the world's religious traditions and wisdom traditions are teaching without saying it, but they're teaching integration. And if ultimately, if we can get scientists to consider Mindsight as real, if feelings are real, and then we can say, hey, you know something? The mind is a self-organizing, embodying relational process, and the way it works optimally is to promote integration. We need people working in communities. We need people to realize that the mind is bigger than a private self. We need to embrace the idea that we're not just a me living in a body. And we're not only a we living in community. How do you integrate identity? So what I'm going to conclude this talk with is what I end the Brainstorm book with, and I suggest in the Mindsight book, which is this. Our modern culture has been overemphasizing physical sight. We have lost touch with Mindsight. So in a way, you can say we've lost our minds. We need to get the mind back. We need to honor the incredible work that many of you are doing, even just being here, saying, I want to be a part of a community, because relationships are the most robust predictor of our well-being. In what areas? Your happiness, how long you live, your mental health, and even your medical health. The best predictor of all that, socially supportive networks of relationships. Relationships. Why? Because the mind is fully relational. So here's what I want to suggest to you. We do need to honor that we live in a body. That's a personal embodied self, and that's great. You should sleep well, eat well, enjoy your body, exercise it, do what you need to do. This is a real thing. Let's call that me. We also have a we. That's our community, where we're connected to each other. That's fantastic. And there's also a reality that if you do this wheel of awareness practice that in our retreat we're doing many times, but you can do it from my website, drdansiegel.com. Just go there for free. You can do the wheel of awareness, but you'll experience the opening of a possibility that the personally held sense of identity is something that families and schools and societies reinforce over and over and over again, but it actually may be an illusion. It may be a destructive prison, that thing that we're taught. And instead, we may have not just a me and not just a we, but an integrated identity where you realize actually you are me. So how would we embrace that? Well, it isn't just me to we. It's some combination of the two. So we can call that MWE. MWE. And together, we can make this a better world. Because ultimately, here's the amazing thing that is revealed. If you really look deeply at integration, honoring differences and promoting linkages, whether you look at that within you or between you or within this sense of a we, integration made visible is kindness and compassion. And so whether you're going to look at molecules or you're going to look at our larger societies, whether you're going to go from synapses to souls, however you want to look at this, integration made visible is kindness and compassion. And so whatever level of analysis you want to look at, we need to work together to make this world a kinder, more compassionate place. And we can make this happen. Thank you very much.